Hello, fellow geeks, and welcome back to another shiny edition of the Far West Systems Management User Group. I am Amy Arwidmark. I am your host and moderator. I am joined by two extremely shiny geeks, Michael Niehaus and Johan Arwidmark, and I will hand the mic over to them in just a few minutes for introductions. But first, I wanted to go through some housekeeping stuff. Johan, if you can go to the next slide, please.
And if I can find my mouse, here we go.
Housekeeping. So yes, the session is being recorded. We believe very much in work-life balance. So if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, if you'd rather go have lunch or dinner or whatever, spend time with friends and family, please do, because you can come back and watch later and catch up. Otherwise, if you're staying for the whole thing, feel free to ask questions. I will pass them on to the presenters as they come in. If you're having any technical issues, maybe try to leave the meeting and rejoin. I assume that everybody can hear me because I can hear my co-presenters. So if nobody can hear, then I guess we're just talking out into space, but just try some basic troubleshooting and things should go well. Please be professional and courteous in the chat. The internet is written in ink, so anything you say or do is preserved in time forever and ever. And I get sent a copy of everything you say in the chat. So please be kind. If you aren't enjoying what you're watching, please just leave or send an email if you'd like to talk about what's going on. Please don't send it in the chat for me to have to read. Thank you. If you use the question and answer box, the question goes directly to me. That's just the way the platform is set up, but I will definitely assign the questions over to Johan and Michael as necessary, and here and there, I'll just interrupt when they're talking if it's a question that seems very relevant to what's exactly being said. You can also tweet about the event using our hashtag FWSMUG. Lots of letters, but it's ours, so please use it. Next slide, please. A big thanks to the most amazing sponsor ever, Marillis, which is my company that I am the CEO and founder of. I'm very happy to be able to continue to give back to the community via this user group as well. Next slide. Yes, we love questions. Questions forever, please. Please don't feel like you can't ask a question. Please do. We'll do our best to get to all of them. You can tweet the questions as well. You can email the question later. If something's really in depth, we can always take it to email or set up a call afterwards, whatever works for you. So with that, I'm going to go on mute and go straight to the Q&A section, and I will be over there handling things, and I will pass it off to Johan and Michael.
Right. Thank you so much, Amy. And of course, thank you, Michael, for joining us for this Back to Basics Windows 10 and 11 setup user group meeting. And we're hoping this can be not just an informative event, but also have some discussions going. We're hoping for a lot of questions. And this is an opportunity to basically get a glimpse of what's going on behind the scenes when you go through your various deployment projects or servicing projects, or whatever you might be doing in terms of Windows 10 deployment, because no matter what the world end up in like cloud services and stuff, someone still needs to put Windows on the box. And whoever that someone is, well, they will be the people that will have to work with these tools and solutions in some capacity. These days, it's usually either yourself doing this, it's a service partner that you work with that is doing this, or it's something that you simply said to the OEM where you buy the computer from that, all right, here's the deal, you guys are doing this. But nonetheless, it has to be done. So, Niehaus, would you like to say a few words about yourself before we jump in?
Yeah, sure. My name's Mike Niehaus. I've been using Windows and deploying Windows for longer than I care to admit. I switched from Microsoft over to Tanium about just under a year ago, and still doing deployment and management stuff, just on a new platform.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I actually took the liberty because I've known you for a while, and I tried to remember when I first stumbled across you, and I think it had to be back in 2004 in Copenhagen when the feature pack was released, or any of the conferences in that time frame. So I was searching through my old presentations for the keyword internals, and I stumbled across this little hidden gem from 2006 where was it MMS? I know you were speaking there as well, but this is where sort of this started in more large capacity for me. The very first there was the feature pack for SMS. Remember that one, Michael?
I have nightmares about that.
Sorry for bringing that
don't
one up.
remember the OSC feature pack. It was pre-task sequenced, so you could do plenty of customizations, but they were kind of like just extra commands that you could add as to different phases of the process as it was going through and deploying the OS. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then with much more flexible techniques for doing the same thing.
Indeed. Sorry, I could not stop myself from bringing that one up. It was a nice, fun blast from the past. But let's go into the year of 2021 instead of almost 2 decades back in time. As most of you know on the call, since basically Windows Vista, we had a very similar set of tools available to us, as well as a toolkit to actually get the tools and to have our various deployment platforms or solutions, using them behind the scenes, most likely. And basically they're required. Every deployment solution is using these tools in one way or another. An interesting part these days is there are actually 2 versions of this tool available. We have the Windows 80K for Windows 10 is still around. And there is also a fairly new released Windows 80K for Windows 11 and Windows Server 2022. I know you, Michael, you spent some time on diving into the differences of this version. And as far as I understand it was not too much of a change.
Yeah, unless you're into .NET Framework and PowerShell on ARM64 devices, there really aren't too many other big differences. There are some new Windows Performance Analyzer related tools, but as far as the core deployment pieces go, no significant changes to any of them. They're just updated builds of the same tools you know and love.
So I've been fairly successful with the earlier versions of this one for Windows 11 to also deploy not just Windows 11, but also earlier versions like Windows 10 and Server 2019, Server 2016. And some platforms you can only have one version, and you can certainly only have one version per server installed at the same time. So it's nice that it is at least somewhat backwards compatible, and quite frankly always has been. Every time there has been a new version of Windows 80K, that one has been available or able to deploy older versions of Windows, and in many cases also newer version of Windows. So for example, currently, the latest 80K for Windows 10 is still 2004. So that's almost a year and a half old now. But that one is still supported, still works with deployer 20H2 versions, 21H2 versions, and I would be extremely surprised if it would not be able to deploy the 21H2 version that comes this fall or shortly. But these tools in the background, of course, they have the Windows pre-installation environment. That's your boot images that you use to kick off deployments, and you usually find out one way or another to start them. These days, it's most commonly to do that from either a Pixie server of some sort or from a USB stick, or if you're in a virtual environment, then of course you can boot from an ISO file. And if you do server deployment, that same ISO file can be mounted into like a RDAC card or an ILO card or something like that in the system to jumpstart the deployment. But for clients, I still see mostly USB sticks or Pixiboots being used for imaging. Some vendors like HP, they do have capabilities to actually stage WinPE inside their little special hidden flash drive on the system, and you can instruct BIOS to boot from that one. That's pretty cool. I know you, Michael, you bought a shiny Lenovo P620 something, and that one was also available or able to, at least through DCP options, get boot images to just load on the fly directly from boot, basically. It's pretty cool.
Yep.
This one will be interesting to see how long this one sticks around, but it's still here. It's still part of when we do refresh and replace type scenarios. It's a migration tool or a backup tool. There are plenty of others. Some customers use this one. Some customers use something else. Some customers have a custom script. Some customers have all their data in like OneDrive for Business or something, but one way or another, there are tools available to make sure that data can be kept during imaging. This little friend, to be perfectly honest, I don't use too much. This was the authoring tool to create unattended files back in the days, which are still in play, but I usually don't modify them too much myself. It's usually up to the deployment system or platform to modify them on the fly during deployment. This little friend here is primarily used to create provisioning packages, which was a sort of a big thing when Vista came back in the days, that vendors would be able to, or admins would be able to create a package that would transform a device into being a consumer device over to be sort of a business type device, install some certificates, upgrade the SKU, apply policies to it, things like that. This one eventually kind of evolved into what is now called Windows Autopilot, basically, where you have a central version of this. It's not exactly the same, but the end result is the same. You have a device that is not managed at the moment, but it will be eventually. This one, unfortunately, died. So that one was removed in 1607 of 80K and was replaced by, at that time, free cloud service, Upgrade Readiness, which was eventually replaced by another cloud service, not free, ended up in Desktop Analytics. So these days you actually need to have some sort of shiny agreement to be able to use that kind of capability. And what these tools are used for is basically to show you in how deep trouble you are. It can give you a little bit of an insight on, okay, I'm on this version now, I'm going to this new version, how much work will it be for me? And it's going to be a very different task if Desktop Analytics or Update Compliance, any of those tools, tells you that, well, out of your 400 apps, 75 doesn't work, or out of your 300 drivers, 200 doesn't work. That's one scenario. Or if you come back and say, well, you have 2 apps that have a problem, you have 3 drivers. All right, big deal. So we can still leverage some of this, but unfortunately, this one is gone. And then once you start to poke around in the file system, you will find, so here is, I think I actually have it on this one too. I usually keep a few 80K installations around, as you do. But this is where you find the deployment kit. This is where you have your Windows PE files. This is where you have the useempty files. This was the designer I talked about before. And then in deployment tools, we have all these nifty little command line tools that has been around for a very long time. So if I start to peek into the 64-bit folder here, for example, I have a DISM tool that I can use. And this one is actually kind of important because if I, let's see what server version I have here. It's 2019, so it's basically Windows 1809 or Windows 10 1809 version. So if I open up the regular command prompt and type this in, I will get a version, of course, matching my server version that I'm on. But if I'm opening up a command prompt from the ADK setup and run this in, I'm on a newer version. So this is a 2004 version of the ADK. So why is this important? Well, you will find that sometimes when you're working with newer versions of Windows on an older OS, you actually must use the ADK version of DISM because it has newer capabilities, and you basically will get an error if you try to use the native one that happens to come with the product. So what I've been taking a habit of doing lately is that if I'm doing work with newer versions of Windows, I usually use a virtual machine or a few that I have upgraded to the latest version of Windows that is available, and I use that for servicing. Because now I can use the native stuff and they work with all versions of Windows. Otherwise, I would be sticking around with making sure I'm actually using an updated version from the ADK rather than using the DISM that actually happened to come within Windows. This is a little somewhat known tool. It's used to create beautiful ISOs. And if you are a little bit clever with PowerShell when you create them, you can easily also configure them to not ask for any questions when booting. So and that depends on your virtual machines, usually if they are in BIOS or in UEFI mode. So if you have a BIOS-based VM and it doesn't have a hard drive, it will happily boot on the ISO right away, whereas a UEFI machine will actually ask you, even if there is no partition, that, all right, are you sure you want to boot on this USB stick or on this ISO? So what I ended up doing on my blog, this is where I post most of my findings. And of course, Niehaus has his blog. I think it's still out of his hours, unless you changed the last few days.
Still there.
Still there, yeah. But in here, and we're going to reference some of these posts throughout the day also, but if you search for quiet on this one, that will be a post about a good ISO file is a quiet ISO file. And that's just a little PowerShell snippet that takes an ISO that you have that does ask for a question and just changes it into not asking any questions by using that little tool with a bit of command line options. Took me a while to figure those out, but eventually got there. So anything you'd like to add, Michael, regarding the structure and the tools that are inside of the ADK?
No, there was one question, though.
Okay.
Someone commented that, well, maybe that looks like it's still the old ADK, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if it is the Windows 11 version, you won't be able to tell any real difference because it's still installed into Windows Kits 10, which kind of goes to show you the real extent of the change, that they're not wanting to break anything. So it'll still be a 10.0 release of Windows. It'll still install into a 10 folder. It's still going to look like Windows 10 for the most part.
Yeah, so on this system here, the ADK version that I had, as you can kind of see from the DISM version also, this is for the Windows 10. This is for the 2004 ADK and also the WinP add-on. On one of my VMs here, I have the same one, but with Windows 10 11, and the structure looks the same on that one. So it's only the versions here that are going to be different in that case. I hope that answered the question. Anything else, Michael, there?
Nope.
All right. Then, of course, Windows 10 and 11 currently supports the same type of deployment scenarios. where obviously a new computer, bare metal type scenarios are still the most common ones, together with servicing scenarios. The two in the middle, yep, they are still used, primarily to fix computers that are a bit broken but not super broken, or if you are in a scenario where you're simply limited on what the in-place upgrade can or cannot do. Replace is somewhat popular still. I mean, most organizations, they actually replace 20-some% of their computers every year. Have old machines going out the window and new machines coming in, and they need to be replaced. And depending on how you're set up, you may or may not have to transfer some data from the old computer over to the new one. And that is what the replace scenario is all about. I know you added some things to this slide as well, Michael. So if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, if you go back several years, the tools out there, even MVP and SCCM, use setup.exe even in new computer scenarios. So in Windows PE, they would run setup and feed it an unattend file, and it would go through the process of applying the WIM file. But over time, most have moved away from that so that they instead just use either the WIM-GAPI APIs or DISM command line or some equivalent mechanism of doing the same thing. So generally, setup doesn't come into play for those first three scenarios. It only comes into play on in-place upgrade. When Windows 10 first came out, there was a whole lot of reluctance to using setup and doing in-place upgrades, but with Windows as a service, you really don't have a great choice. There was another question in the chat too, talking about whether Windows 11 means the death of Windows as a service. I would position it a little differently to say it's more like a fork in Windows as a service. There will continue to be feature updates for Windows 10 until 2025, and there will also be in-place upgrade feature updates to Windows 11 going out for probably years. So now you'll have a choice, and the choice may be determined for you dependent on the hardware requirements for Windows 11, which seem to still be a bit in flux, but once those are finalized, then it should be fairly easy to use an inventory tool, whether it's SCCM or something else, to tell you which machines will be forced to stay on Windows 10 until 2025 and continue to use the old UI, but otherwise everything else will be fine, and which machines could move forward to Windows 11.
Yeah, and it's also the cadence that is different, where Windows 10 have these twice per year release cycles, whereas Windows 11, as far as I've been announced so far, will have a yearly cycle, which I think makes more sense, a bit longer support cycle as well. 36 months, I think, was announced for the shinier editions, whereas you have 30 months on the shinier editions of Windows 10. So I think it's more like showing that we're getting into a more mature, reasonable cadence, because I have yet to work with a customer that actually did feature upgrades twice a year. Most of the organizations I work with, they will do it on a yearly or even year and a half type basis. So yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah, and you've even seen that happening with Windows 10. The last real feature update to Windows 10 was the 2004 release. The releases since then have all just been effectively cumulative updates that throw in a few more features.
Yeah, just tiny enablement packages. They take a few minutes to install, and you boot and you're done. It's not these like hour-long upgrades where, yeah, fun stuff, which is good. I see people on Twitter commenting and hoping that will be like that for the rest of Windows 10 lifetime, but we'll see about that. I have no idea. All right, this one you added in, Michael. This slide here about the command line switches for setup.
Yeah, the setup process really was introduced in Windows Vista you go back further than that into Windows XP, there was a different unattended installation process that was kind of nasty overall. So the setup that's still being used today with Windows 10 and Windows 11 is based on that Windows Vista release. There have been additional command line options added, and if you look at setup.exe/question from Windows Vista and compare it to Windows 11, yeah, there's some new stuff that's added. The interesting thing is the help that you get from /question doesn't even list all the available command line options, but fortunately most of them are in the documentation to explain what they do. There are a number that are probably of interest, and you should be at least looking at them, if not using them. The first one is around BitLocker that was introduced in Windows 10 1803 to let you keep BitLocker suspended through the feature update in-place upgrade process. Prior to Windows 10 1803, when you deployed a feature update, it would put a clear key in place. So effectively, it would leave the drive encrypted, but anyone would be able to get to the drive during the upgrade process and grab data off of it. Obviously, that's a bit of a problem if you think that that BitLocker machine is protected. If you happen to grab one during an upgrade, you could get anything you wanted off of that machine. So they finally fixed that in 1803 with this new BitLocker switch. Try keep active means it will attempt to keep BitLocker enabled through the process. There are some scenarios where it can't do that, like if you don't have a TPM, if you're not using a TPM protector. There's also a force keep active, which would say go ahead and fail if you can't suspend the protectors and keep the TPM in place. And then there's the original behavior that was present in previous releases of always suspend, which would mean put a clear key in place and then reestablish the protection after the upgrade completes. So at the very least, you would want to use try keep active. If you know that all your machines can meet the requirements for force keep active, or if you want them to fail in cases where they can't, you can put in force keep active. The other one, diagnostic prompt, was added in Windows 10 1703 to really help with the, I would call it the SAMI scenario, where people noticed that during the upgrade process, you could press Shift F10 and it would open up a command prompt running as local system. So you could then interact with Windows and insert stuff into it. That's less than desirable. So there was a mechanism that you could disable that using a tag file that you would create in the Windows folder. But now there's a command line switch that can do that for you. So you could specify /diagnostic prompt disable, and it would turn off Shift F10. The next challenge is the media that you're using to do these in-place upgrades gets out of date. So if Microsoft released Windows 10 21H1, that media is current for a month, and then a new cumulative update comes out. So in order to save you the trouble of being able to, or being forced to download new media every month, you could specify dynamic update to go out and tell setup to grab all the changes that have happened since that media was generated. The default is for that to be enabled. You could disable that if you know that you don't want to do that because you're already using the latest and greatest. So you don't want it to go out to the internet and try to grab everything new. In Windows 2004, they added a few more choices to let you control that a little bit more. So you could say, do the dynamic update, but don't grab drivers through a no driver switch. Or you could even say, I want you to grab drivers and no cumulative update through the no LCU switch, or turn off both with no drivers, no LCU. So it gives you a little bit more control. There were some differences in behaviors between different versions. I think we'll get into that a little bit later, but basically dynamic update is good when you need it, but it will be downloading quite a bit of stuff. So if you can instead use content or use an ISO or media that's already up to date, you're going to be much better off. Windows 11 added exactly one new switch specifying /EULA accept. That's not very exciting. Basically, if you were already doing an install with an unattend.xml file, you could already do that through the unattend. So this basically lets you do a clean install of Windows without using an unattend file, because all the other options were already there as command line switches. Now you can also skip the EULA. The last one, skip, finalize, and finalize, really two that are used together, were added also in Windows 10 2004. Those let you break up the in-place upgrade process somewhat. You can use skip finalize to tell the in-place upgrade process to install the new OS release up until the point where it would reboot into the recovery environment to install the new OS. And then you would run setup again with the /finalize switch to say, all right, now I want to reboot into the recovery environment and continue. So it lets you break the process in two. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it does open up some interesting options. You don't necessarily want those skip, finalize, and finalize runs to be too far apart, because it's already backed up the state of the OS and things like that. So it's mainly for cases where you want to be able to run the whole process in the background and then potentially notify the user to say, hey, I want to reboot the computer to finish this upgrade process. It might take an additional 30 minutes to complete. Click OK when you're ready to go. That's the basic idea. All these command line options can also be stuck into a setupconfig.ini file, which is useful in cases where you don't have full control over the process. Maybe you're using Windows Update for Business and you just want to specify some changes to the default behavior. You can put a setupconfig.ini file in the right place, and the setup engine will find it and use it during the process.
Excellent. So we had a few questions coming in as well. One question was from regarding, will we show some tips for Windows 11 as well? And we basically, a lot of the command line things and stuff that we talk about is applicable for both, but we will try to comment out where things are unique for just Windows 11. But in all transparency, it's not really that much stuff from a deployment point of view. Windows 11 brings up a lot of other changes in the interface and whatnot, but from a core imaging point of view, it's actually not too much that is changing, and also from the ADK point of view, it's not too much that is changing.
I think overall the worst things, which are probably still good things, is the change to the start menu layout and taskbar layout configuration processes. They weren't great in Windows 10. With Windows 11 and the new start menu, the new shell overall, they've come up with new ways of doing that using JSON and XML files. So I think overall people will like those better, because hopefully they're a little less flaky than the Windows 10 way of doing the same things.
There was a question from Kelly regarding using volume licensing for testing. When you're planning on using enterprise IoT for production, I mean, essentially you want to make sure that you test the same SKUs of Windows when you do dev and QA stuff. If you have access to the media, they're actually going to be the same. If you have access to an MSDN subscription and you download the volume license media from that site, even though it's named different, it's going to be exact same media as if you download it from the volume license site from Microsoft. And before Microsoft started to actually do these monthly updates of ISOs on the volume license site, a lot of customers actually borrowed the media from the MSDN site and then used instead, because it took them a while to do that.
Yeah, they're much faster at updating the MSDN site. Generally, within a day or two of Patch Tuesday, you'll see updated media out there. VLSC is a bureaucratic, antiquated nightmare, but they do eventually get the media updated and out there, but it does take a little bit longer.
So let's see, there was a question about sending the link in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's see. How the heck do I do that? I don't think I can. I'll send it to Amy. She can send it to the chat or to all the folks. I'm doing my best here. Gary commented on, hi Gary, by the way, hoping that they will actually stick with the somewhat tougher requirements for Windows 11 since it does bump up the security quite a bit. My personal thought on that, I have a feeling they will find a sort of a happy medium where they still keep some of the security restrictions, but maybe relax on the CPU side a little bit. But time will tell.
Yeah, I think the driving requirement behind the scenes on that is that they want the devices to be able to support HVSC or whatever it's called, HVCI. I think it's the right acronym. Basically, they want to be able to run a hypervisor for some of these security features that uses Hyper-V and that requires Hyper-V compatible drivers. And you can only go back so far to have the vendors support those Hyper-V certified drivers, which is why they initially were trying for Generation 8 Intel CPUs and later. But in cases where the OEM is willing to support the drivers that are needed for that on earlier silicon, like Generation 7 CPUs, then they could potentially add those as well. So I don't think it's generally tied to the performance or the capabilities of those CPUs. It's more related to the drivers that are being used for those particular devices.
Espen had a question regarding does dynamic update also force installation of drivers discovered by Windows Update? When I've been using the setup config file, when not using sequences to do servicing, I have actually used options in that file to specify where drivers are located and had the setup pull that one. I actually don't know if you use it standalone, if it also pulls down drivers. I know config manual doesn't have drivers in its software updates catalog, but if you run it standalone, you will have access to drivers through Windows Update. I just don't know if the dynamic update switch actually downloads drivers as part of the setup. Do you happen to know that, Michael?
It will try. Depending on the OS release, it may not succeed if you have WSUS configured. For the later releases, I forget exactly which releases, but at least 2004 and later would bypass WSUS even if you have that configured and be able to grab drivers automatically. Unless you specify the switches to turn that off. You can specify dynamic updates, no drivers, and bypass that.
That's a switch you have.
The biggest challenge that I have with that is that downloading new drivers is generally good, but some of these drivers are just absolutely huge, like NVIDIA drivers. Do you really want every machine that you're upgrading using dynamic update to go out and download a gigabyte LCU and a gigabyte worth of additional drivers just so that you can then install a 4 gigabyte feature update on the device? It's a little painful to have to grab a total of 6 gigabytes worth of stuff in order to do an upgrade.
Yeah, indeed. There was another question from Jason. Can I use Winfield from 11 to deploy Windows 10 and vice versa? So far in my testing, actually, yes. But I'm assuming that you want it to be on the latest version to deploy older versions when all these stuff around Windows 11 finally get finalized, because you can only have one, and it kind of makes sense, at least to me, to use the newer of the two to deploy Windows.
Yeah, of course, standard Microsoft documentation will officially state that Windows 11 80K only supports Windows 11 and Server 2022. But I think people routinely use it for older releases. I've tried it for releases all the way back to Windows 7, and it works just fine. The biggest risk would be offline servicing. If you were injecting drivers or injecting cumulative updates, the new Windows PE environment needs to load the servicing stack from the old OS and make use of it. So as long as that continues to work, which it does, at least as far back as I've tried it, you should be okay.
All right, excellent. We'll come back to the remaining questions later. There's still a few in the queue. Thank you guys for chiming in. It's perfect. Love questions. This is a slide that you added in, Michael, regarding the steps of the servicing aspect.
Yeah, the process overall has been something that Microsoft's been working on for quite a while. And the diagram here is actually from Suma's presentation. I think it was at Ignite 2019, might have even been 2018, that described how Microsoft was working to optimize the process, to get rid of extra reboots, to improve the overall performance, to streamline the process. Because every one of those reboots adds a couple of minutes to the process, and each one of those steps can add time as well. The goal is to try to do most of the work for the in-place upgrade in what's considered an online phase of the process. So you're in the old OS. The user is still being productive in the foreground, in theory, so that you don't significantly get impacted until the end of that online phase. The offline phase, we're using the Windows recovery environment to put the new OS in place and to restore the state back into that new OS before it then boots into the new OS and goes through a few additional steps to finalize the process. So that offline time is really where Microsoft has been focusing, to try to get that offline time as short as possible. The biggest problem with that can be with the tools that you're using to do the online process. Like if you're using a task sequence to do the offline process, the online process, and then rebooting and continuing with the offline process right away, as far as the end user is concerned, all of that time is offline because they don't think they can use the machine while there's this dialogue up on the screen saying, I'm upgrading your operating system. Hands off. You don't want anyone touching that. So the real goal is to get to a user experience where that entire down level process happens in the background in that old OS. And it doesn't matter how long it takes because the user's still happily going about doing their thing. The goal then is that offline time gets minimized. So they continue to tweak that. Overall, the process hasn't changed again since Windows Vista, except for the optimizations as they continue to shift more and more things into the online phase, running in the background on the old operating system. There are still limitations in this process from an upgrade perspective. You can't use your own custom image. You have to use the install.wim that you've downloaded from Microsoft to do the in-place upgrade. You can't change architectures, so you can't go from x86 to x64, which becomes a bigger deal if you're running x86 with Windows 10 because there is no x86 for Windows 11. It's a 64-bit OS only. So be prepared to do a wipe and load in that case. It can't change between certain SKUs. Like if you accidentally downloaded a Korean or European version of Windows, the N or K SKUs, and installed those and then wanted to fix your mistake by upgrading them to a non-N or a non-K SKU, there's no way. So that is a bit of a problem. We'd have to do a wipe and load in that case as well. If by chance you've deployed an LTSC release in the past, you can do an in-place upgrade using setup to go from LTSC to a later semi-annual channel release. So undo that mistake, but you can't do the opposite. You can't change from a semi-annual channel to LTSC via an in-place upgrade. You also can't change from BIOS to UEFI during the process, but you can do it afterwards. You just have to take into account that after you do that BIOS to UEFI change, if you then tried to roll back the upgrade so that you went back to that previous OS release, it would probably be broken. So probably would want to wait a while. So upgrade to the latest feature update. Then after 10 days or whatever it is, whatever safe period of time you might want to roll back in passes, then you could run a separate task sequence to do the BIOS to UEFI conversion.
I always felt it kind of nice to do either BIOS upgrades or BIOS changes as a separate process, because they are all changes that can go very, very wrong. So it's nice to have that as a separate process. And I really like that Microsoft allow you to fix mistakes you did on the long-term servicing channels by migrating upper to a newer normal version, but they don't allow you to make a mistake again by going back to what I consider the wrong version of Windows, even though it's not a technical term at all. It's just, I've seen too many organizations thinking that would be a great idea, just realizing after a few years that, dang, we should have not done that at all.
Yeah, and Microsoft has been pretty quiet so far on LTSC release of Windows 11 too. There will be a new Windows 10 LTSC release in the fall. So yeah, you can upgrade from an older LTSC to that new fall 2021 release. But if you wanted to go to Windows 11, you can't. And there's no real indication yet whether there will ever be an LTSC release for Windows 11. Maybe there will, maybe there won't. Maybe it'll be IoT only. Who knows? All of that still remains to be seen.
Fun stuff. I do have on my blog, if you search for the keyword limitations, I put together a somewhat old list, but it's still valid, of the things that Niehaus talked about in terms of limitations for the upgrade that you have to pay attention to. But some of these you can work around with doing the refresh scenario. For example, if you want to go from 32 to 64-bit, you can do that. But otherwise, you are off to a bare metal deployment of the system. And it's quite interesting just getting some statistics, because I've been part of, in one capacity, one way or another, but in 120 plus migration projects by now, going from 7 to 10 back in the days. And out of these 120, I know of 3 that actually did the full in-place upgrade of going from 7 to 10. The other 117 plus, they actually are doing a bare metal to go from 7 to 10, and then they stick to the whole servicing aspect of keeping that 10 up to date. Because a requirement that I didn't list in my blog post, but it actually is a requirement, and I did not mean to click that. Happiness. You need to be happy with what you have, otherwise you should not do servicing. Because yeah, but okay, you will have a new version, but you won't be happy still. If there is a lot of stuff that you want to get rid of in the old platform because it's been around for like 10 years and you want to go fresh, yeah, by all means do that. There is little point of having like 14 different security agents if you're planning on going to using just 3. So that's a typical scenario where you would maybe do a bare metal once and then continue to service it throughout the rest of the Windows 10 or Windows 11 for that matter time period. Another, it's quite old resource now, but I like to mention it. So on the good old, let's see, channel 9, no, channel 9 msdn.com, that's still around. MSDN, I can't even type. This is going great. I guess that's channel 9. Come on. So if you could look at old events and the old ignites, and you go back all the way to one of the very first ones, but this one in Atlanta, I remember as we went down to the Coca-Cola factory afterwards, and well, they had a lot of drinks there, 600 different flavors if I remember correctly. Sidebar, if you search by speaker on this one, Niehaus is here somewhere, obviously, but there is a lady, Pallavi. She used to work at the setup team back then. She did a remarkably good session on everything that goes on behind the scenes of the setup. So even though this is older, a lot of this is actually still valid, even in modern versions of or newer versions of Windows 10. So if you haven't seen this one, I highly recommend schedule that for Friday night, movie date, bringing family, friends, kids. If you have them, they will love it. It's a good show. Hour-long presentation on just what happens behind the scenes. Yeah. All right. So something I think is kind of interesting in how the ADK integrate with not just the Microsoft deployment solutions, but basically any type of deployment solution that is using this. So as a good example, let me go ahead and just open up the command prompt and create a boot image out of ADK natively, because you can do that. So you can run an obscure batch file, copy PE, specify the architecture, and call it FWSMUG 01, and I have created a boot image in that folder. So this is what I have right now. In this one, this is actually a structure for WinP, where the actual media is in the media folder. But I can use make WinP media command, specify ISO, specify the folder in question, and I can specify where I would like to have that output ISO. So I now have a bootable ISO. So I can take a virtual machine, can borrow this one here, go to a clean snapshot, and I can boot it on the media that I just created. That's for the fun of it. ISO, FWSMUG 01, brand new, and I will boot on it. And I can tell you that this is it. Not much happening. So how come it when you're using your deployment solution, whatever solution that might be, how does it do things differently? They're using I guarantee you, they're using WinPE from ADK. That's the only source for WinPE. But why is it that they are doing things differently? Well, obviously because they are adding stuff to it. So it's a good example. Me and actually Niehaus was involved in that in the beginning as well, but we wrote a PowerShell extension to MDT back in the days. And even if you use a normal MDT boot image these days and boot the very same machine on that boot image, it's going to behave very much differently. It's going to launch a wizard, it's going to ask you for information, yada, 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 etc. The background here is by, of course, Millennium Falcon line jumping into space. But the reason this boot image does more is because in the root of this boot image, I added in an under 10 file, and I told that under 10 file to do something else. Pretty sure Niehaus wrote this little one back in the days, but learning what's going on behind the scenes actually learns you how you can do things prior to or during deployment to put in additional safeguard holders and things like that. My favorite story so far, I was in London helping a company deploy machines for a conference a few years back. But every deployment that we tried would downright fail. And it was failing with this particular error message. It will claim that it couldn't find a valid network adapter. And if you're doing deployment projects for more than 4 minutes of your life, what do you think this one is? Well, missing drivers. It was not missing drivers. It was the conference network that was so poorly set up. So it took WinPE about 7 seconds to get an IP address, which is about 6.5 more seconds that Windows PE happily accepts. So it would fade with that, well, you don't really have a driver type error. So when we learned that, we didn't have a chance to fix the conference network over the weekend. That was not going to happen. But by knowing what was going on behind the scenes, I could craft an under 10 file that would run a script. And this script, I think even Michael would be proud of me for creating, because I spent a lot of time with it. I added in a wait, 10 seconds. During WinPE actually happily waited until it got an IP address and we can continue to deploy our stuff. So there isn't some sort of an advantage of starting peeking around behind the scenes and start to figure out what's going on. And because you never know when that knowledge can help you solve a problem that you accidentally stumble across in your networks. But this is WinPE specific. If there is an under 10 file in the root of the boot image, it's going to run it as part of the startup process here. Because the process in WinPE that starts off networking is WP-init. And that one also looks for this file. If it exists, it runs it. So a little bit of sidebar about that fun stuff. And this is basically what the deployment solutions are using. They're pulling in WinPE from the ADK, and they will add their tools to it, their processes. But it's still kind of helpful to know what's actually in there from the very beginning. So, all right, back to upgrades for a little bit. Funnily enough, this is one of the first blog posts that I ever stumbled across regarding setup.exe itself. And of course, it was Michael that wrote it back originally in 2015 at some point. But then, as you guys know, TechNet was migrated into TechNet Community, or most of the TechNet was migrated in TechNet Community. But you can still find a lot of these old hidden gems, as I call it, for things. So, Michael, this one is yours.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussions over the years about what a good process looks like for in-place upgrade. And I think Mike Terrell and Keith Garner and others have done sessions at MMS and other events where they talk about how they do that in phases. So first phase generally is, let's get the content staged on the machine. Second phase, let's run a compat scan to see if we have some chance of succeeding. And then the third phase, all right, now that we've passed those two, we're ready to go full speed ahead and do the upgrades. So you'll see that sort of process implemented in task sequences, and not surprising, even for the Tanium solution, Keith has worked on building out that same process in Tanium so that we have a 3-phase process of deploy the content, do the compat scan only, and then using the results of that, target the upgrade only to those devices that are already compatible while we investigate and fix the ones that are marked as not compatible. The change in Windows 10 2004 then lets you have a little bit more, I guess, kind of a user-friendly process with the skip, finalize, and finalize that we talked about before. So you could have a task sequence do all of the background work, specifying setup.exe/skip finalize to get the machine up to the point of the reboot, and then prompt the user to say, hey, we need to reboot as soon as it's convenient for you. If you don't answer otherwise, we're going to do it for you in a certain amount of time. So you could have a process like that with the user experience like that. When the user finally clicks OK or the timeout occurs, then you would run setup.exe again with /finalize to reboot the machine and continue the process. So that works pretty well with those releases. There were people that tried that out even prior to 2004 using Windows Update box.exe. If you look at the setup platform, basically it is kind of an entry point executable like setup.exe or Windows Update box.exe. And then underneath that, there's a setup host.exe, which does all the work. So these front ends like setup.exe and Windows Update box just have a little different purpose or behavior depending on how they're used. Setup.exe is the general purpose one. Windows Update box is what's used by Windows Update when you download a feature update via Woo. So you can kind of use these interchangeably, and people have documented how to do that using Windows Update box with a similar set of command line switches to what was added in 2004 for setup.exe to get the same result. There are some pretty nasty notes on the social.technet.microsoft.com website for the process as it's documented there to say it's not supported. Use at your own risk. But if you wanted to do something like that, the setup.exe/skip finalize and finalize switches are fully supported. So you can do most of that through that process. The other switch that Windows Update box has would be a download switch so that you could download the content from Windows Update and get it cached. But obviously, if you're using setup.exe and a different management tool, you can have the management tool take care of that piece.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Cool stuff. So if this is a session about back to basics, I don't think we can go much more back to basics than this particular slide. And I hate to break it to you guys, but even with Windows 11, we still have to worry about drivers in some capacity. What is helping, though, is that since they're changing from to a yearly cycle, at least the vendors will have some sort of, how do you say it, good chance on being able to create them and test them prior to release. And it's not just drivers, it's rated into this mix is also BIOS updates. If you remember from earlier this year, back in February, March, where HP, for example, they published a list of BIOSes or models that basically saying if you're on any of these 20-some models and you're planning on upgrading or installing Windows 10 newer versions like 20H2, you absolutely have to update drivers, otherwise the process will break. And what you will find when you do deployments as well, and not just bare metal ones, but also drivers when you actually do servicing, is that your machines is going to end up in one of 4 different states here, really. And either you're going to be in this great state, which is do nothing. It basically means that whatever was on the box before happened to work with the new version of Windows that you are going to, which is awesome. In some scenarios, you will end up with having to update drivers prior to deploying. It could be like that you're using feature like core isolation in Windows 10 that requires certain drivers or sign type drivers, and the upgrade is just going to say, nope, this is not going to happen unless you have updated drivers prior to deployment. A lot of scenarios, otherwise, you can also add drivers during servicing by either, as Michael was mentioning before, modifying the setup config file if you're using that one, or have a script or a sequence or something providing those drivers to set up as part of your servicing process. And then, of course, there will be a few scenarios where you actually remove drivers prior to servicing, because it could be that the vendor had a driver, it used to work, they no longer support it, and Microsoft now has an inbox driver that actually works with the hardware. But in order for Windows to pick up that inbox driver, you may have to yank away the old one. And unfortunately, still to this day, there is no website that you can go to where you basically pick the version of Windows you're on, pick the version of Windows you're going to, type in the model that you have, and it will just tell you which of these options you need to do for that particular combination of Windows releases and hardware. This is usually something you will have to find out through testing. And I have worked with organizations having two models. That testing there is fairly straightforward. I have worked with organizations that had 296 models. There is no way, literally no way you can test that many models, like even on every 2 year, it just takes too long time. So for those scenarios, we would actually pick the top 21 and test those, and then just hope that everything else worked, because there is not a chance that you can do that. Luckily, most organizations, they will fall into a happy medium of being somewhere in between here. But the more models you have, the more painful servicing in general is. Good news here is that Microsoft actually is expanding on drivers. They are launching this year. They announced it at Ignite in March. A sort of a deployment service that will allow you to get not just vendor drivers, but also BIOS and firmware directly from Microsoft Update. And I will believe that when I see it's working reliable in an enterprise. But it's kind of nice to see that, all right, they're actually taking an approach to give me a one-stop location to get stuff. Because currently, when I need to get drivers, I usually have to go to the vendor websites, and sometimes the vendor's vendor, like Broadcom and Intel and whatnot, to get drivers. It would be nice to have a single source where I can get the stuff that I need. So hopefully, crossing my fingers, it will be a shiny experience. I doubt it will be ready this year, put it that way, but at least it's a start. Not sure if you have any comments on that, Michael.
Sorry, I was answering questions.
I just asked if you had any thoughts on the deployment web service they announced at Ignite that allow you to do more with drivers from basically Microsoft Update, more or less, but through Intune and Config Manager and other platforms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always skeptical because, I mean, there have been conversations around doing this for years, and it still hasn't happened. So when it does finally, we'll celebrate. Until then, I'm not going to get overly excited about it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to try that when it will be around. But yeah, I'm with you on that one. Absolutely. So this means, ladies and gentlemen, that we are stuck with this for a while longer, and simply have to deal with it. This one is interesting as well. Languages and features, especially when you do servicing, where you actually have to provide them to the setup one way or another. And I notice I have a typo here as well. I'm going to fix that one. Beautiful. And any words on this one, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone understands the first item, that the system UI language needs to match. So if you originally installed the OS using English media, you need to use English media to upgrade it. If you originally installed it in German, you need to use German media to upgrade it. And if you didn't carefully control that, and you have a whole bunch of different languages out there in your environment, now you're going to need a whole bunch of different packages to upgrade them. So avoid that. Try to make all of them use the same language and then layer language packs on top of that. The challenge then is when you do a feature update, how do you get all of those languages to persist? Basically, they all have to be reinstalled with each feature update. So you have to have a mechanism in place to do that. We've been hearing another promise for many years around UUP, Unified Update Program. I think that goes back to 2016. Got a blog out there talking about that one. It's still not available. I know a number of customers have tested it out over the last year, so they at least are trying, but still has some challenges, especially for those that are still using WSUS. So still a work in progress there, so that's not an option. Dynamic update does work for this process if you want to have it automatically download all the needed language packs for each machine without using delivery optimization. So there's another 400, 500 meg of downloads required per language pack. So that's an option, and that's probably the easiest way to go. The last option then is you do it yourself. So you can get the language packs locally on the device and then specify a command line switch called install lang packs to tell it the path to the folder containing those language packs. The problem with that is you then have to determine what language packs are there so that you know which files you need to put in place. I looked around a little to see if I could find a script from someone who's done that before, and I came up empty. But the process in theory shouldn't be that hard to figure out what language packs are currently installed on the machine. I know I'm going to be deploying an English OS, so I don't need English, but let's go out and grab the language packs, the lp.cabs for all the other languages that are needed on this device. Download them, stash them in a folder on the machine, and then specify a command line switch, install lang packs that points to that folder. And then setup itself will take care of reinstalling those.
Yeah. I mean, the closest I've seen, not to the downloads per se, but I remember Nikolai back in the days, they're running the MS Endpoint Manager site together with a bunch of other MVPs, Maurice and Sandy and Ben and others. He put together a pretty clever script here, this one here, to making sure at least you're trying to put back what you already had during the image. If you guys haven't seen this blog post, it's a good read, even though it is a few years old as a concept. But yeah, it's a good read. So
yeah, the easy answer would be make sure you have dynamic update enabled. But if you don't want the network hit from that, then yeah, you'll have to do some custom scripting.
indeed, the good news is that you at least don't have to pay for that download. It's one of the CDN downloads that are not tagged with a dollar amount. So that is nice. All right. This one was yours as well, I believe.
Yeah, the setup team decided at one point that customers are going through extra work in a task sequence driven in-place upgrade process to deploy feature updates. And shouldn't have to do that. They want you to use Windows Update for Business. They want you to have all the feature updates performed automatically as part of the just a normal Windows Update process. So don't go through all that effort of creating a task sequence to do it. Instead, let setup take care of it for you as driven by the Windows Update service. The challenge with that is people were doing all kinds of extra stuff in those task sequences, like uninstalling old software packages prior to doing the feature update, installing new versions of them after the feature update's been installed, especially around security software and antivirus and things like that. VPN software often needed to be reinstalled. So people built up these more complex task sequence-driven processes to do the feature updates. So to support this without a task sequence, they built pre and post-processing support into setup so that you could stage onto the local machine a whole bunch of batch files that could be run at various points in the process. So before the install starts, before it's committed, in the case of failure, all of these things could be dropped in place on the local machine and setup would find them automatically, which is good. It would let the process work, but it's not easy to do because it's up to you to make sure that that content is staged on the machine before Windows Update kicks in and does its thing. So it's still requiring a management tool of some sort to get that content staged out on the machine. And when I say content, that would also include all the content that those batch files needs, which is non-trivial. Imagine that you had to push out a task sequence ahead of time to stage the content and download all the apps that you need to reinstall. So, big surprise, almost no one uses this, but it is there. If you really wanted to move away from a task sequence and stage all this content and let Windows Update take care of doing this, you can do it. The hooks are there, but it's kind of an example of the setup team doing things that don't really make the process any better for those that are typically using task sequences to drive this. Instead, they're just kind of off in their own world building solutions for a perceived problem. It is a real problem. It's just I don't know that this particular solution is that helpful. But feel free to play with it.
Yeah, I mean, the few organizations I've seen playing around with this, they're actually just using these batch files to instead launch PowerShell scripts that does the heavy lifting of the job. But as I said, it's still an interesting process to go through. And all of these in-place upgrades and servicing and bare metal deployments, of course, they can and will go wrong at some point. And as usual, with troubleshooting, log files are your friends. There are plenty of like reference type information on the Microsoft Doc site on what each log files are and what it's used for, etc. The challenge is usually that depending on what setup scenario you're working with, it tends to move around a little bit. And you have to simply make sure that you grab the last file, or the right file, I should say. For the longest time, when you did servicing, you used a tool like setup.diag to at least help you quickly parse the log file, because a servicing log file, they can be fairly long. It could be tens of thousands of lines in it. And depending on how good you are on reading log files quickly, sometimes it was a little bit challenging to find the right section in it. So Microsoft released a tool that can help you find those quickly. And I think that a lot of people simply missed that tool was available for download. It's been like 4 or 5 versions already. So Microsoft's actually starting with 24 here, included it now with setup, which it makes sense. And they also updated it so you can have this tool spit out results in locations where you later can inventory that information and make some use of it. But just to prove a point here, I actually have saved a few log files that I borrowed. I asked actually nicely from customers that I worked with that had failures happening to them. So here I have a few folders where I have log files from upgrades that definitely did not go as planned. So if I open up a command prompt here again and go to that folder, here I have one of the earlier versions of the setup diag tool. And as you can see here, you can either run it right on the box that failed, but you can also specify an offline mode where you simply point it to a path to where you have saved or got the copy of the log files from the machine that did fail. So I can borrow this one here and I can run the tool again, specifying that option and simply paste in the path to a failed logging. And let's go ahead and see why this one was failing. Sure enough, in this particular environment, it certainly looked like there was a version of the Trend Micro Office Scan agent that the upgrade at that time did not like at all. Now, it turned out to be not the reason why it's failing, but this is parsing the log file quickly showing us. The reason that upgrade failed was actually because the media that they were using, and this was organizations, they were back on must have been 1709, and they were going up to 1809 because this was in March 2019. So this is what they were trying to accomplish, do a servicing of that, and everything failed. The reason it failed for them because they were using the November 2018 media to do the upgrade. That had a bug in it. That was fixed. So as soon as they switched to a newer media, newer version of 1809 media, the problem went away. But this is a nifty tool to have available to at least parse the log files quickly. That tool doesn't find anything that you cannot find yourself, but depending on how many log files you've read in your life, it can at least speed up the process just a little bit. And that kind of brings me to the point of, yeah, make sure to use the absolute latest media. That's like the key to success. If you can't get your hands of it from Microsoft download site, use one of the community solutions to build it, like OSD Builder or Winwich, any of those tools that helps you create the better media from an older media by applying updates to it. It's going to take a while, but at least it's doable. And Michael actually put a link in here also where Microsoft put in some example on a few, I wouldn't say easy, but steps that has to be done to update the various components in media. In my opinion, tools like OSD Builder is easy to get started with because they're already there. They work, they're tested. But by all means, if you want to play around with it yourself, do that. But I usually find it easier to just go into the volume license site or into my MSDN subscription. I just download the latest media for it. Yeah. Any words on this one, Michael?
Yeah, I think we've touched on dynamic update several times as we're going through here. So yeah. It's good to use if you don't have the fully updated media available to you, but it's going to be faster overall if you can use the latest updated media, just because you don't want each of these clients going out and downloading stuff. Those downloads still don't use delivery optimization. I haven't tried that with Windows 11 to see if they've fixed that yet, but certainly all the Windows 10 feature updates up to this point don't use it. So having each of those clients go out to the internet, yeah, just adds time and network traffic to the process. They have at least made it better in SCCM with an option that lets you turn on the dynamic update process. They do it automatically on 2004 and above, so generally it's a good thing.
I just brought up the link to your blog there that you reference in the post. So if you guys want something to read up on after the movie on Friday, you can check this one as well, of course. Fun stuff. Yeah, we touched on this one also about making sure you're using what I call the right media, always use an updated media. And there are plenty of stories around why you should do that. For example, last year in October, some organizations that were doing servicing, they learned the hard way that every single certificate were gone on the box after doing the upgrade, which is, especially in a working from home time frame, it's not an ideal scenario at all. It's quite the opposite. And the reason it failed was, once again, they were deploying a September media to machines that were more recent in terms of updates. And that was causing that particular conflict. Because, I mean, Microsoft is great at many things, but they are absolutely no good in time traveling. Very few organizations are, by the way. And it's hard for them to test a September media against an update that is 1 month into the future. But the organizations that actually used an updated media, October media, to deploy to these machines that had the October patch, they didn't have the problem. So once again, like the trend scenario, it really pays off downloading an updated media. And it's a bit painful because if you have longer projects running, like over several months, I was helping a customer up in Canada early this spring getting rid of 1809 because they were a bit late to the game. Expired on my birthday even. That was pretty cool. Anyhow, it lasted for 3 months. And that means that we have to update our media 3 times during that time period. So we have to push that one out to machines, but that's not too hard to do. And the benefits that you get from using an updated media, in my opinion, totally outweighs the work it is to have it being pushed out there and used. It's not like you need to retest it. In general, a Windows 10 version or Windows 11 for that matter, I'm assuming, that is patched with a May CU is going to be about as compatible with drivers and applications as one with a June CU applied to it. It's rather the opposite. You will run into issue if you do not use an updated media. Any comments on that, Michael?
One other one. I did some experimentation a number of months ago just to see if I could even take just a simple case of updating the install.wim and getting the size of that back down to the size of the original install.wim, or at least somewhat close. So could I do as good of a job as Microsoft patching that install.wim with the latest cumulative update so that my image doesn't get bloated? My overall summary, no, I can't. No matter what I did, my image would always grow by a couple hundred megabytes. So avoid that. Download the new ISO, use it. They do a much better job and obviously have a bunch of additional cleanup steps in the automated process that they're using to create that media to make sure that it stays as small as possible.
Indeed. All right. Any final questions you would like to answer there? Showing up in the chat, Michael.
There was one question I didn't really know the answer to around in-place upgrades and lapse. I don't know how lapse really affects the process. If you were to run an MDT task sequence, generally it needs to know the local admin password, which lapse is going to be controlling. But the upgrade task sequence from MDT actually uses setup complete, so it doesn't need the local admin password to finish the process. So I don't think it will cause any issues.
It's not something I've tested either, but yeah, sounds like a good blog post, I guess. Yeah. All right, we are up on the hour, and Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I know you came up home late last night from Seattle or to Seattle, and appreciate that you took the time and joining us here today. I do like to highlight, if you are interested in learning more about stuff like this, there are plenty of resources available. There are free ones on my blog and Michael's blog, Deployment Research, out of office hours. And of course, we have our Academy website where we do these 5 or 6 week long courses on various topics. So if you haven't checked out that, please do that. Other than that, I'd like to thank you for taking your time. Thank you, Amy, for organizing this. Thank you again, Michael, for joining, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you, guys.